Morning. I think we can do it today. I think we can finish the story of Edgar Sawtelle. I bet you wanted me to finish it yesterday. So I know I did. I went home and thought, oh, I just so bad wanted to finish it. So let's jump right in. We're back with Edgar. They came up along, now remember, S.A. had come back. She had the key to the car, $300, but then Claude had called his friend, Glenn Papineau, and told him, hey, I have a feeling he's gonna take the car. Okay, let's check this out and see if good wins over evil. They came up along the south fence and crossed the shallow swells of the field, with S.A. for once content to stay near his side. The dry hay stroked his leg as he walked. A whippoorwill whistled from the woods. In the distance, another sadly replied. They stopped at the birches and watched the yard. The truck was parked beside the milk house, the Impala in the turnout by the porch. The yard light cast a yellow glow against the squat obelisk of the barn, leaving the back double doors in shadow. He saw no stripe of light glowing between or beneath the doors. Most important of all, the porch light was dark. Claude was in the house then. When they reached the barn, he paused and turned the latch on the back door and eased it open. Inside was darkness, and the musky scent of the dogs intensified by enclosure and heat. The dogs bayed a greeting, but before they could continue, he and Essie stepped inside. He switched on the aisle lights and walked along the runs, quieting the dogs, and when he finished, he went to the run where Finch and Pout stood and opened the door and let Essie glide in. She nosed her litter mates and turned back. Edgar squatted in front of the pen door. Last time, he signed, just a little while longer. He fetched a bucket from the workshop and carried it down the aisle, working from the front door to the back, upending it and boosting himself up and unscrewing the light bulbs, all but the one nearest the back door, licking his fingers against their quick heat. The act familiar from those nights when his mother was housebound with pneumonia and he had slept on the makeshift bed of bales. As he worked his way down the aisle, he planned where to search. There was no point looking in the mow. Claude had thought the bottle was safe there. He wouldn't have put it back. It could be in the workshop or the medicine room or behind some loose board. It could also be in the Impala, but he doubted that. Nothing important would be in the Impala, not after S.A. had appeared with the key. Seeing Claude rub his hands together and don gloves before touching the bottle made him think it wouldn't be in the house either. He wouldn't have it nearer him than absolutely necessary. But Edgar felt equally certain Claude wouldn't have thrown the bottle and its contents away. He could have done that months ago, but something in the way he handled it spoke of enthrallment as well as fear. Edgar began with the medicine room. 6 enameled white cabinets hung on the far wall. Only 2 contained medicine. The others held stacks of towels and scales and odds and ends rarely used. He sorted through each cabinet, opening the doors and peering in and lifting out the contents and replacing them before moving on, forcing himself to go slowly and look twice, despite his impulse to rush. He didn't want to doubt himself and have to check again. When he finished with the cabinets, he rifled the drawers beneath the counter, discovering as he went that he could run his hands through each drawer's contents without removing things, and yet be certain that nothing as big as the bottle had been missed. It wasn't there, at least not in the obvious places. To search for nooks and loose boards, he needed a flashlight. He walked to the workshop, then he realized the flashlight was still in the mow where he'd left it. He mounted the steps and, working almost entirely by feel, climbed the bales. The filament of the flashlight glowed like an ember when he pushed the switch, then darkened. He located a fresh set of batteries in the many-drawered chests on the workshop's far wall. He walked back to the medicine room, engrossed in the problem of how to reach the boards between the ceiling beams. He could tap each one to see if it was loose. He could get the stepladder from the milk house, or maybe stand on the floor and use a rake handle. He noticed absently the dogs all standing by their doors, worked up again by his running around. But they stayed quiet, as he had asked. After all, it wasn't so unusual for him to be working late at night in the barn. They would calm down soon enough. He turned the corner into the medicine room, still in reverie. There was just time to register a whiff of something aromatic. From the corner, of his eye, he saw a figure standing off to the side. Then the barn whirled him around. A hand as big and solid as a stake pressed a wet cloth over his face. Instantly, his eyes began to water. He choked and then, despite himself, inhaled. It was as if someone had immersed his face in rotting flowers. The odor was unmistakable. Presto. Ether. The flashlight clattered to the floor, and he dug the fingers of both his hands into the hand covering his face. But the wrist and arm holding it in place were thick and cable-muscled, and he couldn't budge them, not even a fraction of an inch. The owner of the hand didn't attempt to move. He just stood and held the cloth against Edgar's face while he flailed. "Just wait," the man said. "This'll only take a minute." It was no surprise to hear Glenn Papineau's voice. Only Glenn had hands that big. Edgar gave up trying to pull the cloth away from his face and began instead to swing his fist backward, to no avail. Glenn simply wrapped another arm around Edgar's chest and pinned his arms. In one of his hands, he held a beer bottle with the thumb over the top. Edgar held his breath, counted the racing beats of his heart. "The longer you wait, the bigger your breath," Glenn said, and he tightened the pressure over his face. He was right, of course, and after a time, an impossibly short time, Edgar began to suffocate, and he drew another breath of the nauseating stuff. And then, because his lungs were still burning, he needed to do it again and again. Everything grew quiet. They stood for a while, and he heard only the huff of his own breath. He grew drowsy, just the way he'd imagined people might if they stared at the pocket watch he'd gotten for Christmas when he was little. Only the pocket watch hadn't worked, and this did. And it was the rhythm of his breathing and not the swinging of the fob. A detachment came over him, even drowning as he was in flowers. He stopped struggling. He began to float some distance from his body, just an inch or two above himself at first. The smell of ether slowly diminished, and after a certain point, he didn't float any farther away. The walls of the room began to move. He felt the soles of his feet dragging against the floor. At the door to the medicine room, Glenn paused, crouched slightly, and tightened his arm so Edgar was pinned against him more securely. Then they were moving along the kennel aisle. Edgar drifted back into his body again, and one of his arms worked loose and dangled limply toward the floor. When they reached the back door, still latched, Glenn lowered him to the cement. The cloth disappeared from his face momentarily, and Glenn's hand appeared, holding the beer bottle. He lifted his thumb and upended the bottle against the cloth. It was difficult for Edgar to direct his eyes where he wanted, or even to focus. He stopped looking at Glenn's hands, and one of his eyes decided to close all by itself. Through the other, he saw a stack of flat brown bags, blurred lumps. Then the cloth was over his face again. Glenn tightened his grip, preparing to stand. The brown lumps resolved into quicklime bags stacked beside the door. The empty coffee can they used for a spreader protruded from a slit in the topmost sack. Edgar's ribs bent as Glenn hefted him to get a solid hold. Then he was rising into the air. He saw his hand reach forward. The rim of the coffee can jagged where the opener had punctured the metal, brushed his finger, and then there was only powder against his palm, dry as moon dust. He tried and missed, yet when he could focus, the can was pinched between his fingers, his hand having somehow corrected the mistake on its own. Glenn was reaching for the door latch. Edgar closed his eyes and gripped the rim of the coffee can with all his might. It was only half full, but heavy as an anvil. All he could muster was a spastic upward jerk, and then his hand fell back and the coffee can clattered to the floor. A heavy layer of quicklime dropped onto his head and shoulders. He had remembered to squeeze his eyes shut, but his mouth must have been hanging open, slack from his effort and the effect of the ether. His tongue and throat were instantly coated with a bitter paste, and he swallowed involuntarily and felt the heat in his mouth and retched. Glenn, too, began to cough. His arm loosened from around Edgar's chest and slipped away, and for a long moment, Edgar hung suspended in the air by nothing at all. He knew it was important that he collect his feet beneath him, but before he could get started, the barn began to spin like a top, with him at its center, and the floor lunged forward, and the fireworks above Scotia Lake burst all over again behind his closed eyes. He was gagging. Even before he could open his eyes, he heard Glenn Papineau's voice whispering his name. "Edgar," he said. "Edgar, are you there?" Then Glenn muttered under his breath, "Oh, Jesus." This was followed by a thump of something hitting the floor. Edgar reached up and carefully drew his fingers across his eyelids. His lashes were caked with quicklime, and it took all his concentration to make his hands brush it away. He cracked open one eye until a slit of light registered, and then the other, and he blinked and looked along the cement of the kennel floor. A cloud of quicklime dust swirled through the air, sifting and settling everywhere. Glenn had staggered backward and fallen. He lay on his side, curled hair grayed, face thickly powdered. His eyes were closed, and his expression was a painfully contracted grimace. "Oh, Jesus," Glenn said again. He brought his hands to his face and pressed his fingers against his closed eyes. The cords in his neck stood out, and he kicked at the floor. Another thump. Then his hands began beating against his face, open-palmed, as if putting out a fire there. With great effort, he got control of them and lay panting. "Edgar, are you there?" he repeated. His voice was hoarse but eerily calm. "Can you get me some water? I just meant to ask you a question. I wasn't going to hurt you, I swear. But right now I need water for my eyes. Oh, Jesus, Edgar." But Edgar lay in a fog, seeing everything as if through the wrong end of a pair of binoculars. When he tried to lift his head, the ache hit him at once, and then the nausea. The florid smell of ether was everywhere now, nearly as strong as when the cloth was pressed against his face. He looked along the floor and spotted the beer bottle lying broken, and liquid ether splashed around it in silver pools. Vapor shimmered in the air above it. Edgar pushed to his knees. The rear barn doors were within arm's reach. He tried to stand and then sank back and dragged himself up the front of them until he could work his fingers into the metal hoop of the latch handle. When the leftmost of the double door swung open, he stumbled drunkenly into the night along with it. He began banging the door with the flat of his hand. Glenn turned his face toward the sound and rose on all fours. "Oh, no, 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 no," he whispered. He crawled forward and stopped to wipe his face and eyes. Edgar pounded the door again, and Glenn started moving, then stopped a second time to beat the heels of his palms against his eyes. A shriek came out of him, high and incongruous, and then he pressed his face against the floor and grounded along, crying louder as he advanced. "It burns! Oh, anything, please! Jesus, God, anything!" Edgar released his grip on the door and tried to step back, but he reeled and fell into the weeds. The dark mass of the barn towered over him, a great black swath cut out of a starry sky. He sat and shook his head. A mistake. The pain nearly blacked him out again. But the fresh night air was bringing him back from the ether, and he could keep his eyes focused. In a minute, he'd be able to get his feet under him. The dogs all stood in their pens, gazes fixed on the spectacle of Glenn Papineau crawling down the aisle. It was the last thing Edgar wanted to see. He wanted the dogs out of the barn, away from those fumes. When Glenn reached the threshold, he worked his fingers along the bottom of the door, then hoisted himself upright, pointing his face this way and that. When he tried again to pull one out of his eyelids open, his body spasmed, and he gave another hoarse and wordless cry and staggered past Edgar in a headlong rush. And then Edgar got his wish, for the dogs wheeled and plunged through the passages to their outside run. He watched as they dove through the canvas strap of their portals and disappeared, until all that remained inside the barn was the apparition of the ether fumes, quavering and rising under that single hot light bulb. Once outside, the dogs began to bark. Glenn Papineau traced a broad circle in the south field, entering the light of the yard like an actor stepping onto a stage. Enormous, thick-necked head and shoulders, powdered and tear-streaked, one hand clasped over his face as if to rip away a mask, and the other hewing the air before him. He staggered up to Alice, parked beside the barn. When his blunt fingers touched her radiator, he stopped and traced the flanges of the grill, the peeling paint of the steering armature, and he dropped to his knees and pressed his forehead against the close-set front tires. "Oh, God," he said, "I can't see where I am. Is that a light? Can anyone hear me? Claude, they won't even open. Can't I please have some water for my eyes?" Then Edgar heard her mother's voice calling from the back porch. Glenn, what are you doing?" Edgar looked into the barn. All the front pens were empty, but some of the dogs in the back runs, unable to see Glenn or his mother, yet hearing their voices, had pushed back inside. Edgar stood, testing his balance. His mother was running across the yard. He turned away and stumbled along the slope behind the barn, clapping his hands as loudly as he could. When he reached the pen doors, he hammered barehanded on the timbers and wires, making every noise he could to draw the dogs out. One by one, they pushed through the canvas flaps over their passageways and trotted out to him. He was going down the line, staying them when a light flashed from the rear barn doors, brilliant and blue. For a moment, the birches in the south field stood icily illuminated, their shadows stretching behind them across the surf of hay. Then Edgar felt a pressure against his eardrums that slowly resolved itself into a sound, as if the sky above had been gripped at the corners and shaken out. Trudy. She lay waiting and listening for the sound of Edgar's footsteps on the porch. She didn't understand what he might be looking for in the barn, and she didn't care. She was willing to humor him in any way required as long as he came to the house. It had been dark for a long time, and he must nearly be done. She thought about how gaunt he looked. She thought about the expression on his face when she'd brought up Almondine. The dogs had began barking, and then among the barks, a man's voice, moaning or crying. She sat bolt upright in bed. "What's that?" she said. What's that?" Trudy thought Claude was sleeping, but at the sound of the dogs, he jerked as if stung, and now he was sitting up too. He looked wide awake. He had a puzzled expression on his face, though it seemed somehow arranged that way, and beneath the puzzlement was a look of alarm. "Don't get up," he said. "I'll check." And he was already pulling on his clothes. The man's voice rang out, and it was coming from the backyard. Trudy couldn't quite make out the words, but there was an unmistakable note of fear and pain in them. "That sounds like Glenn," she said. "Oh, geez, howling drunk, I bet. He's been hitting the sauce lately. I ran into him last week, 3 sheets to the wind before sunset. I told him to come over if he ever needed to talk. I didn't think it would be in the middle of the night, though." Trudy dressed hurriedly and ran to the back porch. Claude stood in the doorway looking into the yard. The truck was parked where he had left it that afternoon, facing the hitch end of the tractor. The dogs were flagging up and down their runs, barking and looking toward the south field. At first, Trudy didn't see anything unusual there. Then the image registered. It was Glenn. He was kneeling in front of the tractor with his forehead pressed against the close-set front tires, as if in supplication. Claude seemed rooted to the porch. She pushed past him and ran across the lawn. Glenn was sobbing. His hair and face and shoulders were powdered white. Behind him, the shadow of the barn was divided by a flickering light, and in it stood Edgar. The moment their gazes met, he turned and walked into the dark, staggering as he went. Trudy pulled up short, feeling as if she were splitting in two. One half of her cried, "Go to Edgar," and the other half wanted only to distract Claude. Close behind her, from the sight of him, the idea that Edgar might run away again was paramount in her mind. At first, she didn't even connect Glenn's presence with Edgar's. She only wanted to turn everyone around and get them facing the house. "Glenn," she said, "what's going on?" "Trudy, please, get water." Glenn said, "I need to wash out my eyes." His voice was quaking. He alternately clutched the front of the tractor and held his hands over his face, as if by tremendous will, not touching his eyes. He sucked his breath through his teeth. The tracks cut through the white powder on his cheeks. By then, Claude was there, and he knelt beside Glenn. "All right, Hoss," he said, "we're cutting you off for the night." He worked his shoulder under Glenn's thick arm and began to guide him to his feet. "No," Trudy said. "Wait." Claude looked at her, his face carefully composed into a mask of surprise. She ran her fingertip across Glenn's cheek and brought it to her mouth. There was no mistaking the awful chalky taste of quicklime and the burning sensation the moment it got wet. She looked into Glenn's flower-white face. "What were you doing here?" "Ask him after we get him in the house," Claude said. "That's quicklime." "I know what it is," she said. "First, he's going to explain what he was doing here." These last words came out as a screech. "I just wanted to ask him a question," Glenn said. "Tell her, Claude. It was just to ask him a question." She turned to Claude. He shook his head and shrugged as if to say it was the ranting of a drunk. "Liar," she said. Then, before she understood quite what she was doing, she twined her fingers into the curls atop Glenn's head and yanked his face up. Her other palm caught him squarely on the flat of his cheek, crack of skin against skin. Glenn swayed and nearly collapsed, but instead he began to whimper and clutch at his eyes. "You'll wait," she said, "until I know my son is safe." She untangled her fingers from Glenn's hair and stood. The dogs in the front runs pressed against their pen doors, barking and whining and straining to see what was happening. From behind the kennel, Trudy heard a rattling and banging. Pen doors being opened. She had taken only a few steps toward the sound when the first azure bubble of gas bellied out of the back doors. It crawled into the air, shifting from blue to yellow as it rose. It lit the field, then disappeared bottom to top, halfway to the eaves. There was the low buff of vaporous ignition, the sound of a match tossed into a barbecue soaked with lighter fluid. Then a second belch of flame shot out of the doorway, more orange than the first, eating itself almost before it had a chance to rise. In the still night air, a thread of smoke began to seep from the top of the doorway. It tracked upward along the red siding and pooled under the eaves. With sickening rapidity, it broadened into a gray ribbon that spanned the doorway. Trudy stopped, flat-footed, though her thoughts momentarily log-jammed. She jerked about in a circle, unable to decide in which direction to move first. A vast, soft explosion had erupted in the barn. Why? They didn't store flammables in there. Glenn had been in there. He was covered with quicklime. Had Glenn meant to burn down the barn? Had he doused the inside with gasoline? Why? Claude had Glenn on his feet, and they were walking toward the house. Glenn's massive arm draped over Claude's shoulders. Had Claude not heard the sound? He was speaking urgently to Glenn, but Trudy couldn't make out what he was saying. Then Glenn stumbled and drove them both to the ground. Not until Opal rounded the back corner of the barn and bolted past her did Trudy know for certain that Edgar had to be all right. He was releasing the dogs from their pens. She ran along the front pens, unlatching the doors and throwing them open, clapping and shouting, "Come out, 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 out!" By the time she finished, 24 dogs were loose. Another 12 or 14 were rounding the barn from the back. Packs formed and reformed and flowed into one another and split apart as they dashed behind the barn, across the yard, and circled the house and garden. Claude had gotten Glenn to his feet again, and the two men waded through the dogs that surrounded them. "Get!" Claude shouted at the dogs, and come on, to Glenn. "Call the fire department," Trudy shouted. "He set the barn on fire." Claude stared back at her for a moment, and then he nodded and turned. With Glenn's arm draped across his shoulder, they hobbled the rest of the way to the porch steps, and he there guided the man down and ran past him into the house. Two of the dogs began to snarl at each other. Trudy ran to the nearest and lifted it by its tail and wheeled it backward, shouting, "Go! Leave! Get!" To the other, she dropped the dog's tail and stepped quickly forward and shook it by the ruff. When she looked up, a pair of dogs were running through the orchard, close to the road. "You two," she called, "come." The dogs wheeled and began heading toward her, but instead joined one of the packs circulating in the yard. She began methodically recalling and downing dogs one by one, looking over her shoulder and waiting for Edgar to appear. Every time she looked again, more smoke streamed from the barn. She was surprised, given the chaos of the moment, how many of the dogs held their stays, but every one looked as if it might bolt the moment she turned away. They craned their necks to watch the others plunging through the field and circling the house and charging up to the porch steps where Glenn Papanow sat cradling his face. Back to Edgar. 14 runs jutted into the long night shadow of the barn. Edgar staggered along, palming up the wooden latches and flinging open the windows without waiting for dogs to emerge. The after image of the fire flash twisted in the air before him like a violent snake. By the time he opened the last run nearest the silo, the dogs were circling him in the dark, pawing one another and bucking in excitement, foreshortened leaps. Then the sound of Glenn Papanow's voice echoed from the front yard. Opal and Umbra stopped, cocked their heads, then turned and galloped side by side through the pack and rounded the stone belly of the silo. "Yes," he signed at the rest. He swept his hands along their sides to get them moving. "Go, get." They turned their heads to mouth his hands, then, one after another, bolted past the silo until only Essie remained seated in the grass. She was nosing the plush fur along the back of her hind leg. He knelt and pushed her muzzle away and ran his hand across singed fur, brittle as wire. Another patch on her tail. The flash must have caught her on the way out, he thought, but the canvas flaps over the door had damped it. Essie nosed his hand aside impatiently and chewed at her leg and snorted to clear the scent from her nostrils. She scrambled to her feet and shook out. Edgar gestured toward the silo. "You two, get." She looked at him, blinking, then turned and bounded into the pale light. Shadow out of shadow. A thing created mid-leap, her ears pricked forward, eyes wide, jaws agape, for the very first time wolf-like to Edgar's eyes. He ran to the rear of the barn. A band of smoke crawled past the lintel above the double doors and lifted skyward. How long had it taken to release the dogs? A minute? 2? How could that much smoke be pouring from the barn? From his vantage point, he could see Glenn sitting on the porch steps, hands to his face. A half circle of dogs surrounded him with their heads cocked. Edgar's mother held a dozen or more dogs in quivering downstays in the side yard, and twice that number still ran wild, bunching up in packs and sailing through the orchard, splitting and joining in a chaotic ballet. As he watched, his mother halted a dog by name and walked to it, downed it using both hands. Then, noticing the gazes of the dogs, she turned. They began a simultaneous exchange of sign. Are the pups with you? Are you okay? No. Yes. I'll get them. Before she could sign anything else, he ran through the double doors. The interior of the barn was eerily hot. The bulb he had left screwed into its socket flickered away, and the smoke billowed and streamed past it, along the ceiling into the night. The air smelled of hickory and burning straw. Edgar came upon the remains of Glenn's ether-soaked rag and orange-fringed char. In 2 of the pens he found straw still burning, the flames dispersed in yellow. He tore open the doors and kicked the straw until the embers were dark, and he looked about. The plank walls were scorched in places, the timbers of the runs blackened. He found glowing, smoking piles of half-burnt straw in 3 other runs, and he stomped them out. Overhead, the heavy crossbeams were sooty, but not aflame. Yet the smoke had not lessened. From outside, he could hear a shouted exchange between his mother and Claude. He ran down the aisle looking for the source of the smoke, but all he saw was a faint orange glow between 2 of the ceiling boards. When he looked again, even that had gone black. From the whelping room came a pair of high, yiking cries. The air inside was clear. The solid walls of the whelping room had blocked all but a thin scum of smoke, but the 2 pups were panicked, almost hysterical. The moment he unlatched their pen door, they scrambled past, turned the corner, hindquarters skidding out from under them, and were gone. He followed them out. He wasn't groggy from the ether anymore, but his head throbbed. Once outside, he gasped the clean air into his lungs and raised his hands and pressed the lump where his head had struck the floor. What he felt wasn't even pain, just the black hand of unconsciousness passing before him. His knees almost buckled, and he yanked his fingers away. The smoke pouring out of the doorway had doubled since he'd gone in and blackened. He ran across the yard to where his mother stood among the dogs. The 2 pups were yapping and tumbling at her feet. She lay her hands on his shoulders and then on the sides of his face. Are you okay? He nodded. All the dogs out? Yes. Then keep away from the barn. It's going to burn. No, I put out all the flames I could find. Have you called the fire department? She shook her head. We can't get through. What? When they put the extension in the barn, they routed the line there first. Claude just tried the house phone. The wires must have burnt or shortened already. No. The lights are on the barn. The phone there might still work. Edgar, listen to me. No one goes into the barn. Look at that smoke. Look at it. The barn is gone. A glance was all it took to know she was right. Smoke had begun to seep from the eaves, rising and blacking out the stars in ebony rivulets. The sight of it pressed some tremendous weight down on Edgar. He knew very well how dry and brittle the wood in the barn was. He might have extinguished all the flames he could see, but something was smoldering inside the walls and ceiling. Even if they called that instant, it would take time for the Mellon Volunteer Fire Corps to arrive. Half an hour maybe, and by then, the barn would be ablaze. All at once, the image of his father lying on the workshop floor flashed into his mind, snow seeping toward him. How he wouldn't look at Edgar, wouldn't breathe. These records are it, he'd once said. Without those records, we wouldn't know what a dog meant. When Edgar turned back, his mother was looking at the house. Glenn sat slumped on the porch steps, towel pressed to his face. Claude was standing beside him, speaking in a low, urgent voice and trying to pull the towel away so he could flush Glenn's eyes with a pan of water. Why would Glenn do this? His mother said. Damn it. He had ether. I knocked it out of his hand. What was he doing with ether? He had it in a bottle. He had a rag over my face. She looked at the gray powder in Edgar's hair and on his clothes. You threw a quicklime at him? Yes. That flash was ether fumes? Yeah, I think the heat of the light bulb set it off. What did he mean to do? I don't know. She was shaking her head. It doesn't make sense. How did he even know you? Then her voice trailed off. She seemed to register for the first time that Glenn Papanaugh was not in uniform. He was dressed in jeans and a checkered short-sleeved shirt with its own bib of quicklime. Claude had coaxed him into setting aside the towel, and as they watched, he pulled back Glenn's eyelids and tipped water across his broad face. When the liquid touched his eyes, Glenn's back arched. He pushed Claude away with a sweep of his hand and hunched over again. How did he know? She said. She took a tremendous breath. Tears spilled onto her cheeks. She began to walk toward the porch, hands fisted at her side. Then her strides lengthened and she was running, and her voice rose to a wail, asking the same question over and over. Edgar forced himself to turn away from the house and away from the real living dogs on the ground at his feet. Those dogs could take care of themselves for the few minutes it would take him to do what he had in mind. He ran to the front barn doors, rolled the heavy iron brace bar away, and pulled the doors open. A billow of gray smoke engulfed him, carrying with it the smell of roasting straw and wood. He stepped back, and after a moment, the smoke leveled out and around 5 feet above the barn floor. If he stayed low, under the ceiling of smoke, he could easily reach the workshop door. The cabinets themselves would be impossible to move, but he could carry out individual files. The most valuable would be the newest. Go back 5 generations. How many times could he go in? How many files each trip? They would get scrambled, but there would be time later to sort that out. He permitted himself a quick look at the porch steps, and his mother stood facing Claude and Glenn. "How did you know, Glenn?" she cried. "Tell me how you knew Edgar was here." Claude was standing beside Glenn on the steps, and he leaned over and began to say something. "Shut up, Claude. Shut up. I want to hear this from Glenn." But Glenn sat silently, rocking and grinding the towel against his face. Trudy knelt and put her hands on either side of Glenn's massive head and wrenched it toward her. If Edgar watched even a moment longer, he thought he would run toward the house, toward Claude, and then there would be no hope. He began drawing the deepest breaths he could, and before the doubts and second guesses could begin, he ran into the smoldering barn. Hot smoke billowed over his back. The sole light bulb at the far end of the barn flickered between folds of smoke. Walking, he might have crossed the distance to the workshop in a few seconds, but with his head down and peering over for flames, it took much longer. He touched the handle of the workshop door and rubbed his thumb over his fingertip like a safecracker to take the temperature. Warm, but no warmer than anything else in the barn. He swung the door open. Smoke sucked into the darkness and equalized between the aisle and the workshop. His eyes began to itch, and a stream of tears leaked onto his face. He scrambled through the doorway, flipped the light switch, and the bulb in the ceiling fixture came on. He breathed a little sigh of relief. He knew the room so well he could find his way to the file cabinets in total darkness, but he wouldn't be able to locate the records he wanted just by feel, and there was no time to find the flashlight. He opened the highest drawer of the rightmost file cabinet. A solid mass of papers, divided 100 times, came toward him, the tabbed edges on top of the manila folders running in a long, ragged hump down the center, and each penciled with a name: Cotton, Vesta, Hoop, Frog. He drove his hands into the mass awkwardly, lifting out a swath, and in the process scattering notes and photographs and paper clips. He left them and turned and scuttled through the doorway and down the aisle. The papers were heavy, and they slid dryly against one another in his arms. Then he was in the yard and in the clear air, and the far edge of the lawn. He stopped and bent and spilled the papers onto the ground. And for the briefest instant, Edgar felt something new, something impossible and wholly out of place. A sense of elation, as if somehow he had traveled back to the moment his father lay on the workshop floor and found the thing that would save him. Then just as quickly, the sensation was gone. Something in him clamored for it again at once. He ran to the barn and fled heedlessly through the smoke and filled his arms with another pack of manila folders and all the papers and photographs inside them. He'd almost reached the double doors when the cement floor surged upward. He saw it tilting at him, but there was no time to recover, and he smashed shoulder first into the hinges of the right-hand door, kicking as he fell and clutching the papers to his chest. The impact brought him to his senses. He lay for a time, half in and half out of the barn. After a few breaths of clean air, he pushed to his feet and staggered to the grass. When he reached the folders he had already rescued, he bent at his waist and let the papers flutter and splash to the ground. "Remember me." Far in the distance, his mother's voice. "Edgar, stay out of there." She was standing by the porch. Glenn had gripped her wrist in one giant hand like a straw in a vise. Edgar looked at her and shook his head. There was no time to argue. She couldn't feel what he felt or hear what he heard. She wouldn't understand the rightness of it, that there were no words for the sensation that had washed through him. His mother would have run forward to stop him, but she couldn't break Glenn's grip. She whirled and began to beat at Glenn's face with her free hand. It brought the enormous man to his feet. He was confused and in terrible pain, and he stood thrashing his head side to side to avoid her blows. His stance was wide-legged and low, and then in one fluid motion he swept one of his thick legs under hers and folded her up in his arms, and together they toppled onto the grass. By the time they came to rest, Glenn had scissored his legs over her. "What's happening?" Glenn said. His voice was filled with pain and fear, but not the slightest hint of physical effort. As if all those wrestlers' reflexes had come forward on their own volition to protect him. "Why won't anyone help me?" he cried. "Doesn't anyone understand I can't see?" Edgar took a deep breath and turned away. The last thing he saw was the entwined figures of Glenn Papineau and his mother as she twisted and fought in his arms, and Claude standing on the porch steps above them. He trolleyed along Palm and Knuckle in the workshop, careful now to stay below the strata of smoke, holding his breath as long as he could until it burst out of him. He was able to get the remainder of the first drawer's files. Coming out with his arms filled, it was much harder to stay low. His eyes teared, and the light in the workshop became a greasy blur of yellow and gray. He had to be careful not to gulp the air. The crashing dizziness of his last attempt was warning enough. Even so, he felt smoke burning along his windpipe and in his lungs. Outside, he spilled the papers onto the ground and dropped to his knees. He supposed a normal person would have been coughing, but all he felt was a strange wooziness. He bent and forced himself through the motions, hacking and gasping to drive the smoke out of him. He looked up to find Essie standing before him, tail flagging. Her ears were up high on her head, fully attentive, eyes gay and glittering. The same expression she had worn parading around the cove after the tornado. She looked prepared to follow him into the barn. He took her rough in his hands to shake her down, scare her away, then stopped himself. They were done with commands. He put his hand under her belly and drew her attention into him. Away, he sighed, pouring into the gesture all the force he could muster. "I know you understand. I know it's your choice. But please, away." As he backed up a step, eyes intent on him, and she looked at the other dogs circling under the apple tree. Then she faced Edgar again and bucked a little and held his gaze. "Yes," he sighed. "Yes." She bounded forward and swiped her tongue across his face and bolted into the mass of dogs. All of them up now and running. Even the ones Edgar's mother had stayed. He wanted desperately to know if Essie had understood him, but short of giving up on the records and rushing after her, there was no way to be sure. He turned back to the barn. He'd almost passed through the wide double doors and into the smoky interior when he thought of the milk house and what he would find sitting inside it. He crossed along the front of the barn, and when he reached the milk house door, he flung it open. The first time he saw a flame, he told himself he would stop. Do you remember what he threw in there? Claude. Get another tissue. Aren't you really glad that I've got a whole fresh box of tissue? Thank you to my friend Debbie. She takes good care of me. Let it burn, Claude thought. He was standing at the bottom porch step watching disaster unfold and trying to decide what to do. The disaster was not that the barn was going to burn, certainly not. The barn was insured after all, and the dogs were outside and safe, even if they were running loose at the moment. At worst, losing the barn would make things inconvenient for a few months. They'd have to board the dogs somewhere, though. Finding families to look after them in the interim wouldn't be that hard. But realistically, they'd have a better, more modern barn before snow fell. Nor was the disaster what had happened to Glenn. Though Claude had flushed Glenn's eyes with water as soon as they'd reached the house, the quick climb had already done some gruesome damage. It was hard to feel sorry for Glenn. The man must have used enough Prestone out there to launch a rocket. Not what Claude had suggested at all. Nope. The disaster was that Edgar kept running into the barn for those records, returning again and again to the workshop and the filing cabinets while smoke poured from the barn's eaves. Edgar had even fetched the wheelbarrow from the milk house, and as Claude watched, began rolling it in a broad act toward the barn doors. If all that weren't strange enough, Glenn had now taken Trudy in some sort of a wrestler's hold. In a moment, Claude was going to have to say something or do something to make Glenn release her, but he didn't know what that might be. The man had wrapped his huge limbs around Trudy, and his embrace reminded Claude somehow of the tree roots at Angkor Wat, slowly crushing those ancient stone temples. The way Glenn was acting, he might not stop unless he was unconscious. Yet Claude didn't want to step in until he was sure nothing could be done about the barn. The barn had to be a lost cause. That's why he had told Trudy the telephone line was dead. By now it probably was dead. There was something enthralling about the sight of smoke rising from the barn, black into black, easing such a broad swath of stars. It reminded Claude just how big that old barn was. When he'd first arrived home, he'd been struck all over again by its size. Then quickly enough, it had become ordinary in his eyes, the way it had been when he was growing up, making other people's barns look like miniatures. The volume of smoke belching off the roof put things into perspective again, and he marveled at the man who had originally built the place. What plans must he have had to build a barn like that? Better take a good look, Claude thought. He watched the smoke seeping from the gapes around the big mow door, but the door Edgar had thrown open the night he pushed Papineau down the mow stairs. The door they had hauled 6 wagon loads of straw bales through just 2 weeks earlier in a long day of sweaty, exhausting effort. Strange, all that smoke rupturing outward, writhing and folding over itself, and yet no sound, no flames. Claude knew enough about fire to understand that this was a phase, that the fire, or what was soon going to be a fire, was smoldering along the old timbers, probably in the straw as well, exploring hidden paths and alleyways in search of fuel and oxygen. He looked into the sky again. In the waxing moonlight, there was not a cloud to be seen. Edgar had peered out of the smoke, pushing a wheelbarrow mounded with papers. The sight chilled Claude. Trudy, thrashing pointlessly, began shouting to Edgar to stay away from the barn, but Edgar wasn't in any immediate danger. Only a few steps lay between the workshop and the barn doors. Unless the whole structure suddenly burst into flame, there was little chance of his getting caught inside. Until then, at least on the surface of things, Edgar was doing right by salvaging the files. A help later, not imperative, but good to have. The problem was that bottle. In truth, Claude had lost his nerve. The bottle had already been well hidden in the mow, and he knew it, but when it looked like Edgar might be snooping up there, Claude had panicked and dug it out. After that night with Benson and that bizarre reenactment, he had been certain Edgar had found it once already. He should have poured the bottle's contents into the creek the very next morning. He'd fantasized about doing that so many times, but he had never answered the question of what would happen once he dumped the stuff. Would it just sink into the ground, disappear, or would it trace some subterranean channel back to the house, to the well, to him? More important, and this was hard to admit, once whatever roiled inside that bottle was gone, it was gone for good. And the idea that it could solve his worst problems had become part of Claude's nature. The knowledge gave him confidence, the way some men drew confidence from a wad of money in the bank or a gun in the glove compartment of their car. It had become at times almost a living presence to him. I exist for a reason. And then the exhilaration and self-loathing would, when he had listened. But if he was careful now, that bottle would be incinerated, and along with it, the very worst part of him. If he was careful. He'd already made one mistake. He'd carried the bottle out of the mow, only to realize how few other places he trusted. There hadn't been time to think things through. Trudy could have walked in at any moment, and what exactly would he have said if she'd asked why he was carrying a bottle ribboned with hangul lettering and with some liquid inside that looked like the purest, most distilled venom? Hiding it in the house was out of the question. It frightened him to be so near the stuff. He could barely stand to hold it in his work-gloved hands. After Gar, he had showered until the hot water heater in his little rented apartment emptied, and when it filled, he'd emptied it all over again. Once he'd taken that bottle out of the mow, there were few options left. The medicine room felt all wrong. Trudy went there sometimes. She might open a drawer, think, what is this? Twist the wax seal stopper, raise the bottle to her nose. So it had to be the workshop, where Trudy virtually never stepped foot except passing through on her way to the mow. He considered briefly putting it in plain sight out on the shelves as if it were nothing of value. With so many odds and ends there, one more bottle wouldn't stand out, but it would stand out to anyone looking for it, and his own gaze would always be drawn to it. So he'd wrapped up the bottle in an oily rag and buried it under a mass of old letters at the back of the bottom drawer of the oldest filing cabinet. No one but Edgar cared about that filing cabinet, and even Edgar couldn't possibly care about a bunch of old letters. A good place he'd been sure of. And yet, the The moment the bottle was safely hidden, a new worry came to him, and he'd walked to the medicine room, selected a syringe from a cabinet, and worked it into the bundle of rags alongside the bottle. Claude was still standing on the porch steps, watching the scene play out before him. One of Glenn's legs was thrown forward over Trudy's hips, and he had tilted them both so they were lying on their sides, facing the barn. Claude could barely see Trudy over Glenn's broad back. He sighed and stepped off the porch and onto the grass. Trudy had stopped struggling and lay enraptured, murmuring something like, "No, no, not now," watching Edgar as he came running out of the barn, pushing another batch of records. The dogs were scrambling every which way. Two of them raced over, paused to scent Trudy and Glenn, then leapt away. Claude knelt behind Glenn, reached over his shoulders, and tried to peel the man's enormous right hand away from where it locked around his own left wrist. "Glenn, enough," he said, surprising himself with the evenness of his voice. "Let Trudy go. We can't help you unless you let Trudy go." Glenn didn't respond, but the sound of her name, Trudy began to thrash. Though she was lithe and strong, it was no use. Glenn dwarfed her. His shoulders bunched and his arms tightened until she stopped. She craned her neck to look at Claude. She was crying. "Make Edgar stop. Please, Claude, make Edgar stop going in there." Claude just nodded. There was nothing to say in reply. He stood and began to cross the yard, mind racing. He didn't like having to make decisions that way. He needed time to think things through. But he could hardly sit and mull. Yes, he could stop Edgar, knock him down, and hold him like Glenn was holding Trudy until the fire was so advanced no one could go inside. To Trudy, it would look like he'd saved Edgar from madness, while inside, the bottle would crack and melt, its contents boil in the flames. Afterward, there would be Glenn to account for. The man was blind, his eyes etched globes. It was a testament to Glenn's strength that he was conscious at all, even if half out of his mind with pain. The blindness would overwhelm him later on. All those late-night conversations had left Claude with no doubt about that. When that happened, Claude could insist that Glenn, in his grief, had mistaken an innocent consultation over Paige's death for something entirely different. And Trudy might believe that. Glenn had, after all, tried to kidnap Edgar, and if that wasn't damning enough, after Trudy hit Glenn, he had reverted to this strange wrestling maneuver, moaning and rocking and refusing to release her. But there would still be Edgar. The boy, it was hard to think of him that way, gray-haired from the quicklime, tall, whipped thin, might make some claims, though any real evidence would long have been dispersed in the clouds. In return, Claude could raise questions of his own. What had happened with Paige and the Mo really? With luck, they might find the key to the Impala in Edgar's pocket, along with several $100s. Would anyone be that surprised to find a runaway preparing to steal a car? It could work, Claude thought. All he had to do was stop Edgar, save Edgar's life. In Trudy's eyes, and wait. Afterward, there would be a sense of release, a new beginning for all of them. The fire, the reconstruction would change everything. A turning point. Claude was walking toward the barn, considering this, when he felt a blunt pressure against his thigh. He looked down, and Essie stood before him. She pressed her nose into his leg just above his knee, and his heart began to jangle, because for a moment Claude saw a syringe in the dog's mouth. But his eyes had been fooled. There was nothing in her mouth. He had been thinking of the night Edgar played his trick in the kennel. Essie stood in front of him, gaze resolute, mouth agape, eyes glinting and mischievous, as if waiting to see his reaction from that distant night. Was it possible the boy was so single-minded that he'd come back to play this trick again? All at once, Claude's certainty wavered. He hadn't been thinking clearly. It would not work. Not if all it took was the gaze of a dog to make his hands shake and blood pound in his brain. He was kidding himself. Over and over again, he would have to look Gar in the eye just that way. No, not Gar. Edgar. Why had he thought that? No sooner had he asked that question than he knew the answer. Because Edgar, all softness stripped from his safe, lit aslant by the yard light, hair grayed by quicklime, looked so much like his father. Because carrying the files in his arms, the boy even walked with the same hunched-up step Gar had used, cradling pups in and out of the whelping pens. Because some nights, Claude couldn't sleep after the tick of a bug against the bedroom window made him start up in bed, adrenaline flooding his veins, heart leaping so ferociously he had to walk it off, and after that he couldn't lie down. Better to sit facing the night and take sleep that way, if it came at all. And because the look on Essay's face made him think of the morning he glanced up from the sink to discover Edgar outside the window in the apple tree. How finally he had to turn away. When Claude looked down again, the dog had slipped away, rejoined one of the packs, bounding through the yard. Claude walked to the double doors and entered, stooping. The air was breathable down by his waist, though it reeked in his nostrils and stung in his eyes. He could see only a few feet ahead, and when he reached the doorway of the workshop, he made out the wheelbarrow, askew in the center of the workshop, and Edgar yanking open the top drawer of a file cabinet, standing upright just long enough to scoop out the drawer's contents, then ducking again. Edgar glanced over and spotted Claude in the doorway. He stopped for a moment, and they looked at one another. Then Edgar turned and snatched another batch of files from the open drawer. The drawers of the file cabinets nearest the door flung half open and empty. Edgar had been working from the news records to the oldest. That explained why he hadn't already walked into the yard with the bottle in his hand. Claude stepped past Edgar to the last filing cabinet, and he slid open the top drawer and began scooping armload after armload of records into the wheelbarrow, filling it as fast as he could, though it was already nearly overflowing. Edgar kept working on the bottom drawer of the adjacent file and turning and heaving papers. Some missed the wheelbarrow entirely and scattered toward the doorway. Then Edgar stood, took the handles of the wheelbarrow, and disappeared into the smoke. He could have kicked himself for not thinking of the wheelbarrow sooner. It was possible to get everything this way, all of it, the whole history, outside and safe. Working frantically, he had already pitched the contents of one complete file cabinet onto the metal basin of the thing. The smoke in the workshop was bitter and thick, and he dropped to his knees to suck the clear air near the floor. Now he rose again and plunged his hands into a drawer and turned and dumped an armload of papers. How swiftly his mind was spinning as he worked, how euphoric the sensation of deliverance that beat in him. He felt he had struck another bargain, just as he had watching the apple trees in the winter, and he worked with great intensity. The part of him that loved order cried out of the wilderness of what he was doing. The neat march of generations so quickly scrambled, but he couldn't stop. He had meant to throw everything into this one final barrel load, but the papers had already begun to mound over the rim. Much more would just slide and spill as he rolled through the turn into the aisle and would be lost in the smoke. He glanced at the workshop door when Claude appeared, crouching low and squinting against the smoke. Claude's expression was a kind of perfect blankness, or rather a melange of expressions, any one of them fleeting and half made and out of registration with the next. Edgar thought that someone else, watching from another viewpoint, might see concern or apprehension there, or fear or desire or revulsion. But for Edgar, the result was something incomprehensible, unreadable, committing to nothing and summing to nothing, as it had always been with Claude. Edgar had not in the least forgotten what he had seen in the mow, or that stream of memory that had passed through him in the rain. He had never had much of a plan for when he returned, except to say what he knew was true and keep saying it without evidence or proof. Then, before he had a chance to do anything, Claude was past him and had yanked open the topmost drawer of the last file cabinet and began shoveling armloads of paper into the wheelbarrow. He didn't say anything or even hold Edgar's gaze. When Edgar understood what Claude was doing, he turned back to the files and they worked side by side. The wheelbarrow was quickly overfilled. There was no time to explain and no language for it. Edgar just grabbed the wheelbarrow's handles and ran through the door. Keeping low enough to breathe clear air was difficult, and twice he had to halt to steady the mound of papers. As soon as he was outside, he dropped to his knees and forced another coughing fit. This time it tore at his throat. Then he stood and shoved the wheelbarrow into the grass and pitched it over and watched the papers scatter, sheets of white and cream everywhere, and writing on them like every language in the world, some ancient, others yet to be invented. Pictures and pedigrees and log sheets and notes everywhere he looked. The story of 40 generations. 50. He looked toward the house as his mother lay bound up in Glenn Papinel's arms. When she saw Edgar, she stopped struggling and turned her face to him. "Let it go, Edgar. Let it go." "I can't," he sighed. "Not yet." He turned back to the smoldering kennel, and his mother's cries, intertwined with Glenn's moans, made an unnerving duet. The once narrowed ribbon of smoke had become an opaque mass that belched from the top half of the barn's entryway. He wondered if the straw in the mow had caught fire. Not even the tiniest lick of flame was visible through plumes of black smoke poured from the roofline. He understood what it meant to go back into the workshop. He did not believe Claude was there to help him, yet every file he rescued restored some piece of a world that he thought he had been lost forever. For so long he had lived divided from his father, from himself, and now from Almondine. What he meant to do was not a question for him of wisdom or foolishness, courage or fearlessness, insight or ignorance. It was only that he could not split himself the way he once had. He could not choose between imperatives, to resurrect or revenge, to fight or turn away. Inside were 2 more cabinets filled with files and the letters from Brooks and the Master Litter Book and the new Webster Encyclopedic Dictionary of the English Language with Alexander McQueen's essay on the significance of naming and page upon page of notes, markers of every dog Edgar had ever known. He pushed the wheelbarrow forward at a trot, and for the last time, he passed through the double doors and into the barn. If he worked fast, he could be in and out in 3 minutes. And if he needed more time, he had an idea that might clear the smoke long enough to get everything else. An idea that had come to him long ago in a dream. This is back to Claude. The moment Edgar disappeared through the workshop door and into the smoke, Claude snatched open the bottom file drawer, dug the rag-wrapped bundle from beneath the mass of letters and newspaper clippings. The syringe, folded into the oily fabric, worked loose and fell into the drawer, and he pawed through the chaos before his fingers touched the round plastic barrel. He retreated across photographs and pedigrees scattered over the floor like a lunatic's history of the kennel. When he reached the workbench, he turned his back to the room and knelt. He wrapped the rag around his hand and grasped the bottle through it and worked the stopper loose and with great care set it on the floor away from himself, back far in the corner. He twisted the sheath off the needle. His motions were careful, but he was working in a rush, and by accident, he jabbed the needle's point lightly into the flesh of his right palm. Before he even felt the sting, he had jerked his hand away. The puncture was too small to release even a single drop of blood, but an infinitesimal red meniscus colored the needle's point. When he looked at the bottle again, an iridescent rivulet had crept up the throat of the glass. He set the needle against the sheer lip. To see the fluid wick so eagerly into that minute steel artery made his skin crawl. He needed only a drop, but half a cc got into the barrel before he could put his thumb above the plunger, and even then its insistent upward force felt to him like some feral thing lunging from its cage. With effort, he pushed all but a fraction back into the bottle. When he drew the syringe away, a silver filament quivered in the air. He set the needle tip against the glass and turned it and withdrew it again, leaving a drop of clear oil that shivered and collapsed and slid down the inner curve of the bottle's neck. He left the bottle and stopped and tossed away the rag and turned, holding the syringe at arm's length, and he waited. The file cabinets opposite stood hazy and remote through the dense smoke. He wasn't sure Edgar meant to come back, but he could drop the syringe and be out of the barn in seconds if things suddenly felt unsafe. Fire didn't move that quickly, he thought. He looked at the bare bulb shining in its ceiling socket and wondered how long before the insulation and the wiring melted. The smoke carried a awful scent of roasted flesh. A nest of mice, he thought, or a bird in the eaves, overcome. All that smoke and still not a sound, not a flame. Outside he could hear Trudy crying and calling out. Then Edgar appeared, hunkered down behind the empty wheelbarrow, bent so low over the thing that the skid scraped the cement floor. He jammed its nose first into the space below the Moe stairs, dropped to his knees, yanked open the bottommost drawer of the oldest cabinet exactly where the bottle had been hidden, and began to heave out letters and papers. Claude stood. He remembered how the old herbalist had used a sharpened reed, how his withered hands had shaken with palsy afterward. Now that seemed like such a mild reaction, for Claude was suddenly conscious of all the mechanism of nerve and muscle and ligament that animated his fingers. The syringe began to tremble in his grip. With his free hand, he squeezed his shaking wrist until the bones inside ground one against another. He crossed the workshop. The act itself took just an instant. When it was done, he backed away, reaching behind with one hand to swing the workshop door closed. All at once his teeth began chattering, and he bit down so hard to make them stop that a groan escaped him. He had to get a hold of himself, he thought. All he needed to do now was keep Edgar in the room and let time pass. But his heart threw itself against his ribs, and the blood rushing through him felt as heavy as mercury. He pressed his back to the door and slid to the cement and noticed for the first time that the syringe was still in his hand. With a convulsive jerk, he flung it away, as he had with Gar. Edgar kept pitching files into the wheelbarrow as if nothing had happened, then abruptly sat back on his heels and looked over his head and behind as if startled by a sound. He He turned toward Claude, but his gaze hardly lingered. Then he stood and made his way across the workshop, working hand over hand along the shelves beneath the stairs, and began looking for something in the corner where the long-handled tools stood in a tangle. When he turned, Edgar held a pitchfork in his hand. Oh, God, Claude thought. But Edgar wasn't looking at Claude. He walked to the center of the workshop, bent low to keep his face out of the thick mass of smoke. He crouched for a moment, squinting and wiping the tears from his eyes and swaying as he fixed the position of something near the light fixture on the ceiling. Then Edgar stood and drove the pitchfork straight up into the smoke. His first thought was that something had fallen on him and dazzled a nerve, the way it happened when a person struck their elbow. A bolt of coldness in the back of his neck, nothing more. He had time to reach into the file drawer and press another handful of letters and papers between his palms and turn and dump them into the wheelbarrow, and then an icy wave radiated down his back and toward his limbs, settling in his crotch and knees and armpits and in the palms of his hands. Strange beyond words, the sensation. He reached back and touched his neck. He turned. Nothing had fallen. Claude had pushed the workshop door closed and now sat clumsily at the base of it, looking frightened and panting through his mouth. Then, for no reason, Edgar could see the smoke suddenly tripled in thickness until the walls of the room were barely visible. The ceiling shrank to an orange smoke-smeared crystal. He told himself he should cough, and he bent down and put his elbows on his knees, but the result was feeble. He needed to clear the smoke from the room. He was being overcome, and he made his way to the implements leaning in the corner, rakes, hose, any of them would do. It didn't matter. The one that came into his hand was a pitchfork. When he turned, the room careened around him. Ether, he thought, because that sense of detachment had come over him again, the same as when Glenn had held the cloth over his face, the feeling that he was outside his body looking back at himself. But this was different, too. He couldn't shake it. The idea that something had fallen on him. He touched his head. His fingers came away bloodless and dry. He made his way to the center of the workshop, trying to keep his balance. It was impossible to see the ceiling through the smoke. Every time he drew a breath, something scraped inside his lungs. He forced himself to concentrate. He tried to see in his mind where the hay hatch was positioned relative to that ceiling light. Twice he staggered off to the side, and he had to look at his feet in order to keep from falling. At last he took a guess. He lifted the pitchfork and drove it upward. The tine struck wood. Then he pushed. There was solid, unyielding resistance. He yanked downward, and the tines came free, and he thrust up into the smoke again, a foot to the right. This time something gave. He felt the hatch lift an inch, then catch cockeye in its slot. He shifted position and gave one final heave and felt the hatch clear the opening and slide along the mow floor above him. Then the pitchfork clattered down. He found himself lying on his back, though he didn't remember falling. The air near the floor was blissfully clear. Smoke eddied and whirled about the hay hatch, a sweeping tidal movement like watching something alive. It had worked just the way he had hoped, just the way it had happened in his dream the first morning when his father appeared in the rain. The sight filled him with exultation and sadness. The smoke was rising into the mow, stretching when it came to the lip and tumbling upward. He could see nothing in the mow itself, no towering bells, no beams, no tackle, no bulbs among their rafters, only 1,000 layers of gray lifting upward. He thought he might see flame, but it was nothing like that, only the fluid rush of the smoke. He'd meant to do something after he rolled the final barrel of records out of the barn, but something important. He didn't blame Glenn Pappinout for doing what he'd done. He'd only wanted to ask Edgar a question, he said. But Edgar had something he'd wanted to say to Glenn. And now he closed his eyes and imagined Glenn standing there and imagined himself saying the words so Glenn could hear them. "I'm sorry," he said. He imagined it with all his might, with all the power of his mind. "I'm sorry about your father." He felt something recede inside him, a diminishment of barriers. He lay and watched the smoke crawl along the ceiling, and after a time, Almondine stepped out of some hidden place near the file cabinets. She walked to him and looked down at him and licked his face. "Get up," she said. "Hurry." She panted. Her ears were cupped forward and drawn up tight as they were when she was most fretful, though her movements were measured and calm. He was not surprised to hear her voice. It was just as he'd heard it in his mind all his life. "I thought I'd never see you again," he sighed. "You were lost."
Yes, lost. You didn't need to come back. I would have found you. No, I did. I understood some things while I was gone. And you had to come back. Yes. What was it you understood? What my grandfather was doing. Why people want Sawtelle dogs. Who should have them? What comes next? You understood all those things all along. No, not in this way. For a time they just looked at one another. So many things that have happened, he sighed. Yes. Sit here beside me. I want to tell you about someone. His name is Henry. Get up, she said. Come outside. I told him my name was Nathu. He laughed a little as he said this, knowing she would understand. Mowgli's human name. Yes. Was that better? He thought about the question. At first, later, it didn't matter. I meant to tell him different, but I never got the chance. Almondine sat and peered at him, brow knit, eyes like cherry wood polished to the glass. It came to him then a wholly new thought, that Nathu was neither his name nor not his name, that even Edgar was a thing apart from his real name, the name Almondine had bestowed upon him in some distant past, long before he learned to carry ideas in time as memories. Whatever name that was had no expression in human words or gestures, nor could it exist beyond the curve and angle of her face, the shine of her eyes, the shape of her mouth when she looked at him. Babu and Tinder stayed with Henry. Yes, I shouldn't have turned away when I saw you with Claude that day. I don't know what happened to me. You were lost. I was lost. Get up, she said one last time. Come, he said, lie here by me. Almondine settled herself and leaned her chest against his side. Her face was near his face, and she looked at him and followed his gaze up toward the ceiling. He closed his eyes, then opened them again with a jerk, afraid that Almondine had gone, but there had been no need to worry. They lay on the floor and watched the smoke writhe across the ceiling. It was not so much like smoke at all anymore, but a river, broad and placid, beginning nowhere and ending nowhere, flowing on and on. The two of them lay on the bank of that river as it swept past like the creek in a flood of time. Perhaps this river, too, had once been divided by a fence, but no more. On the far side, a figure appeared, distant but recognizable, someone he longed to see so often. Since that night, the dogs had howled in the rain, and the world had begun to turn on such a new and terrible axis. He'd meant to say something that night, the most important thing of all, it seemed to him now, but he cowered when the moment came, and the chance was lost, and afterward he had been damned. He set his fingers in the fur at the base of Almondine's throat. Breaths came into her and left, came and left. He closed his eyes, for how long he didn't know, and when he opened them again, the river was just the same. But somehow the man had crossed to meet them. Perhaps they had crossed, he couldn't be sure. Either way, it made him happy. He felt he had a voice inside him for the first time, and with it he could say what he meant to say all along. The man was close, and there was no need to cry out the words. He could whisper, even if he wanted. He smiled. I love you, said Edgar Sawtelle. Oh, goodness, friends. This chapter is Claude. He sat with his back to the workshop door, waiting and counting, watching Edgar lying in front of him. A vortex of smoke rushing upward into the dark rectangle overhead. There had been one terrible moment when he thought, it isn't working. But he'd been mistaken. Instead of advancing on Claude, the boy had used the pitchfork to open a hay hatch. After he fell, he had lain looking into the mow and working his hands over his chest in a stream of sign that Claude could not hope to read. That had gone on for a long time. Then, as if Edgar had come to some sort of decision, he draped one hand atop his chest, laid the other on the floor beside his leg, and hadn't moved since. Claude thought of that rain-soaked alley in Poussin, what it had been like watching the old man drop the tip of his sharpened reed onto the crippled dog's withers. How gentle the motion, how the dog had paused from its lapping at the crock of soup and looked up and crumpled. There had been only an instant's delay. It seemed as if the contents of the bottle never acted the same way twice. Perhaps over time it had lost potency. Perhaps it drew on something different in each person. He would have liked to go back now and ask the old man to explain it. The bottle sat across the room at the base of the workbench. He had to fight the desire to scramble over and twist the glass stopper into place, to seal it up again, at least for as long as he was confined to the same room with it. Only his dread of nearing the stuff stopped him. And if he touched it again, he couldn't be certain he wouldn't leave it behind. He debated whether he should carry Edgar's body out. He could sling the boy over his shoulders in a fireman's carry and stagger into the yard. That would be better for Trudy, he thought, and he would have done as she asked. Or he could tell Trudy the boy had grown confused and wandered into the smoky center of the barn, and though he had searched and searched, he had finally been driven out by the smoke, certain that Edgar must have emerged from the back doors. That was better, but only if it looked as if he had searched for a very long time, as long as humanly possible, dangerously long. He forced himself to sit 1 minute more. He concentrated on stopping the jitter in his knees. It cost him nothing to wait, besides breathing a little smoke and having to look at the boy lying there. Claude could not fix his gaze on Edgar for long without a tremor rising from his insides. But that was foolish. If anything, the boy looked peaceful. Then from the mow came a sound, a groan that rose and pitched to a squeal like shearing tin. Claude looked up. There was no change in the character of the smoke, and no flames glowed through the open hatch. But suddenly it felt dangerous to be in that barn for even a second longer. The boy had been right about one thing. Opening the hatch had cleared much of the smoke from the workshop. But Claude was deciding right then it had been a less than great idea for another reason. The more he thought about it, the less desire he had to stay in the barn. Black fluid smoke from under the door began to creep around either side of him. Standing brought it on a wave of dizziness. He stepped back from the door, taking care to avoid the boy's body. Standing hands to knees, he gasped breaths of the clean air. Then he twisted the knob on the workshop door. It was as if he had swept aside a dam. The acrid smoke that poured in tore at his throat, forcing him back into the corner. He knelt and coughed, and when he looked up again, the smoke was rushing toward the open hay hatch. Not rising, rushing. And for the first time, he saw the interior of the mow glowing orange through the curtain of gray and brightening. He scrambled into the kennel aisle, hands on the floor. The atmosphere roiled in barrels around him. He was at the double doors, poised to step through, when something made him pause and drag the back of his knuckles across his tearing eyes. Precisely where the smoke belched into the light of the hooded lamp outside the door stood the figure of a man. As Claude watched, the figure tattered and disappeared. Claude closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, the figure had returned, not so much engulfed in the smoke as made of it. Through it, Claude saw the papers Edgar had retrieved, scattered across the grass of the lawn. Glenn was his first thought, but Glenn's voice echoed from out in the yard, and even at a glance, Claude recognized his brother's form. This was hypoxia, hallucination, smoke rapture. What happened to oxygen-starved divers? He knelt and pressed his face against the cement floor to suck clear air into his lungs. As he stood again, the last ceiling light in the aisle winked out. Outside, the hooded lamp above the doors cast its light just long enough for Claude to see clearly that it was Gar, beyond any doubt. And then it was dark. He stood for a moment trying to force himself forward, but in the end he turned to face the interior of the barn. Another pair of doors waited on the far end. He could traverse the length of the kennel and gain the clear summer night air the way a few seconds' travel if he hurried. He navigated along on the darkness, imagining the arrangement of kennels runs on either side of him, the long straight aisle, the door to the whelping room ahead, the beams of the mow passing above one by one. He didn't break into a run until the timbers began to shriek far overhead. A twisting scream this time made him sure the entire structure must be ready to collapse, and yet that couldn't be happening. He'd barely seen a flame. He stared at the ground. Through a gape in the smoke, a thin pair of orange lines heat on his face. He'd taken only a step or two in full light when an imageless blaze of white blossomed and dissipated before him. Then he was sitting on the cement. It took a moment for the pain to register, to understand he'd run into one of the posts lining the aisle. He reached out, felt it, sooty and warm, though he couldn't see it. His throat burned as if he'd swallowed acid, and when he clambered to his feet, a coughing fit nearly drove him to the floor all over again. The collision had turned him around. At first he couldn't tell which way he'd been heading, and over the sound of the timbers he thought he heard his name being called. "What was that?" he shouted. "Who is that?" But there was no reply, just his own voice returning flatly through the smoke. He shouted again. Something about the shape of the echo gave him his bearings. To his left, he made out a dim rectangle of light through the smoke. A doorway, but front or back? He turned away from it and began to walk, hands outstretched, moving in the straightest line he could. His fingertips touched wood, then a hinge, then a wire of a pen door. He stepped back and corrected to the right. He only had to follow the perfectly straight line of the aisle to find the back doors. It should have been simple. He took another step into the blackness. Time and again his hands pressed against wire where there should have been open air. The aisle seemed to veer left, but when he moved left, it veered right, as though the sound in his ears was not the breaking strain of burning wood, but the agony of those great beams twisting. At last, a wind began to pass along the aisle, dragging smoke across his face like a streamer of hot silk. Now he had reason to panic, but to his surprise, the sensation was exquisite, as if he had longed for it all his life. He stopped. Then even the sound of the timbers quieted, and there was just the hollow roar of wind. He stood in the darkness, eyes closed, letting the smoke caress him. Then he lifted his hands and twined his fingers into the warm wire mesh he knew he would find waiting him. This one is Trudy. For the longest time, neither Claude nor Edgar appeared in the doorway of the barn. Trudy called until her throat grew raw, her voice a high and wordless lament, and her body thrashed and twisted in the cage of Glen's arms. In time, she fell silent, and she began to think it wasn't Glen holding her back at all, but the black vine, growing now thick and strong and pressing its roots into the soil to draw the earth tight against her and outward, then in all directions so that its tendrils pinched and grabbed it, at time itself. And time, like a slowly scrolling stage backdrop, became entangled, and the black vine drew down that canvas to lie slack and unsprocketed beneath a great proscenium, where upstage all manner of machinery and instruments nameless and never before seen lay roughly strewn. And there Trudy found herself unable to look away from all those things she'd worked so hard not to see. When she'd viewed the canvas long enough so that no part of it remained hidden from her and no part mistaken, the black vine relaxed its grip, and time curled up upon its spindles again and rolled forward, and Trudy was lying once more on the grass of the yard. Slowly, her face was turned until the light of the present world shone in the glassy lune of her eye. And as she watched, flames began to eat through the long shingled roof of the barn, not the tiny licks of orange that had so horribly filigreed the eaves, but real fire now, living fire that burst forth into the air and disappeared and erupted again as if lunging in desperation to grasp the night and pull it in. A gout of flame flashed high above the barn's roof, twisting inside a pillar of smoke. A scarlet rose that blossomed and vanished. From inside the mammoth came a low, prolonged groan. The center beam of the roof sagged, then the wreathing smoke shuddered and retreated into the barn, as if the structure had drawn its maiden breath, and the inferno began. As quickly as that, one moment, a mass of smoke, the next all was flame. The awakening scorched Trudy's face. The light it cast painted the fields and woods all around them red. A heat washed over them. Glen Papanow released Trudy and stood and put his hands in the air and began to slap at his face and chest and hair, throwing a nimbus of quicklime into the air around him. "Am I burning?" he cried. "Oh, God, have I caught fire?" But Trudy neither moved nor answered. She was not there. She did not know she was unbound. Glen Papanow staggered away, navigating by meridians of heat. Trudy lay on the grass, eyes fixed on the open doors of the barn and the flames that thrust through them like incandescent limbs. And Glen Papanow plunged across the yard, a blinded bull, stumbling, falling, rising again, bellowing over and over. "What's happened? What's happened? For God's sake, what's happened? The Sawtelle dogs. They had measured their lives by proximity to that silent inward creature, that dark-haired, sky-eyed boy who smoothed his hands along their flanks and legs and withers and muzzles, a boy they'd watched since the moment of their birth, a boy who appeared each morning carrying water and food and every afternoon a brush, who pronounced names upon them from the leaves of a book. They had taught him while they watched him, and they had learned by listening to Almudine. And though they had seldom seen it, they understood the meaning of fire. They looked at the flames soaring into the night sky and their sparks bursting from the timbers, flying upward, ever upward, and the bats flickering into the smoke and curling and plummeting, and they knew they had no home. They circled the fire until their chests belled and their tongues hung loose from their mouths. Embers settled on the pile of papers the boy had made, and a few of those began to curl and rise, flaming into the air. The flames leapt to the orchard trees by wind and sympathy until only the house and the young maple and the elderly apple tree, whose fingers brushed the house, opposed them. Red beams beat across the trees. In the south field, the birches and the white crosses glowed like rubies. The shadows of the dogs cast from the top of the hills darkened the forest. Great drabs of tar flew sputtering from the barn roof until the whole structure became transparent down to the glowing ribs. The wires of the pens pooled like water and boiled away. The fiberglass top of the truck crinkled and smoked and shrank inward, belching a nacreous yellow cloud. The wires strung between the house and barn lay snarked and smoking along the ground, and in time the tires of the truck swelled and burst like gunshots, and the truck tipped its lee side toward the flames, lacking the sense to save itself. Far away on the distant ledge of the world, a thunderhead glowed in response to the fire's call, but if those clouds came, they would offer nothing but an inspection of the bones charred and smoldering. The woman lay sprawled on the heat-curled grass between the house and the fire, deaf to their calls, deaf to the cries to the blind man standing over her, ignorant and insensate, as though she had departed her body and left it heaving on the shores of the world. Those who understood saw that the time inside her had been boiled away by the heat of the fire, and if anything, thought she might rise transformed into a swan or a dove. The heat grew. It drove them first toward the house, then to the garden behind the maple. Fire echoed between the now incandescent orchard and the creaked stone pedestal of the barn. Those dogs were not all equally good. Some of them fought and others cowered, and still others traced idiotic paths around the spectacle and harassed the blind man as he dragged the woman across the grass. Yet witnesses they were, one and all, trained and bred to watch, taught by their brooding mothers to use their eyes, taught by the boy himself to wait for a gesture that put meaning into a world where none existed. Among them, the two pups whimpered and cried and pressed against whomever didn't snarl. One way or another, all oriented themselves against the hemisphere of fire. Some turned their faces into the night. Some sank to their bellies and rested their jaws on their forefeet, facing into the flame like sphinxes into the sunset. Essie ran down into the field then. A few of the other dogs followed, including her litter mates and also the two pups, these last, slow and confused. When she reached the rock pile, Essie waited until all had stopped with her. Then she circled back toward the yard, snarling at any who tried to follow. They milled and waited. She appeared again with half a dozen more dogs following, the rest unwilling to leave the aureola of heat. She trotted through the pack and along the edge of the field, her back reddened by the blaze, and when they reached the old logging road, she passed the birches without hesitation and departed the field near the southwest corner, cutting crosswise through the forest. In the woods, they slowed their pace, the dogs spread out beside and behind her. They passed through fence after fence. Some of the dogs fell away, lost or disheartened, but she did not stop or circle back. They would follow or they would not. She had only made that possibility clear. Nightbirds decried their passage. A menage of deer sprang from their bedding grounds. She led the dogs along, checking her way, though it had been marked so obviously that some ran ahead. And then, realizing she'd lost the pups, she didn't stop and backtrack. She found them huddled near a fallen tree, whimpering and shaking in the moonlight. She lowered her muzzle and they licked her face and swatted their tails through the bracken, and in return she mouthed their necks and nosed along their sides and feet and bellies. They turned and trotted away. She coaxed. They began to follow again. The forest streamed round. The night passed. They trekked through marshes and forded creeks until the dark vault overhead gave way to a deep orange, the sky ignited by what they'd left behind. Presently, as they emerged from the woods, before her a field sloped away, fallow for many seasons and dotted with scrub pine. The grass bent wet and heavy in the still morning. From behind her came the hoarse cry of the diaspora, bursting through the underbrush. When the sun broke over the treetops, all before her glittered. To the west, across the field, Forte paced the tree line, his figure cutting back and forth on the thin fog line that clung to the ground. To the east, where the field bottomed out, a scattering of lights twinkled among them. Trees here and there with the slanted rooftop of a house was visible, as they could hear the earth breathing around her, if not for the white steeple that rose over the treetops and the headlights that flickered into view on a blacktop far away. She might have been looking on a scene from the beginning of the world. A thing like a song or a poem rang in her ears. There was Forte. There was the village. One by one, the Sawtelle dogs trotted from between the trunks of the trees and followed the forest edge until they all stood together. Finch and Opal, Umbra and Pout, and the two unnamed pups, and all the others who had followed through the night. They had traced Essay's gaze across the field, first east, then west, and shuffled about her and licked her muzzle, making their desires known, and then they waited. As he stepped into the grass, she stood, paw lifted to her chest, nose raised to scent the air, watching it all. For an instant, as the morning light brightened, everything in the field stood motionless. She looked behind her one last time into the forest and along the way she'd come, and when she was sure all of them were together and no others would appear, she turned and made her choice and began to cross. That's the end. Where do you think she chose to go? For me, I like to think she went to Henry. I like to think they all went to Henry. I guess I like to think that as time went on, that Henry and Trudy find each other. Is that silly? I hope you have loved this book as much as me. Please leave a comment. Let me know what you think happened. Let me know what you think about giving your dog choices. Letting them figure some things out. I guess it's a lot like raising kids, isn't it? I'm sorry this one was an extra long, but we needed to finish it. I hope you have a wonderful end of the year. We're going to start a new book. My husband has already requested one, although I've never read it, so I just don't know. But coming at you in January. Hope to see you then. Have a great day.